Hello learners of South Africa, I trust I find you in good health and I trust that you are preparing well for your upcoming exams. My name is Michelle Mason, I come from Fourways High School and I'm very happy to try and help you through this stressful time. Just a little bit of inspiration for you. Just remember that your studies shouldn't be about putting one huge effort in now. It should be the sum of many small efforts throughout the year. And many small efforts will count to big success. All right, so make sure that you are well rested, make sure that you are preparing well, make sure that you give yourself enough time to complete your studying and be well prepared for your exams. Without further ado, let's have a look at what we're going to be going through today. We're going to be focusing on climate and weather today. If we have a look at the checklist, there's a couple of things that I would like you guys to make sure that you are well prepared for in order to understand this section. Now, the first of those is to describe global air circulation, which was covered at the beginning of the year. So global air circulation is very important. Tropical cyclones, especially in terms of their formation and effects, those are very important when you are answering just about every single matric paper that you'll come across. You also need to be able to identify and explain weather patterns over Southern Africa. You need to be able to look and interpret synoptic weather maps. And you also need to be able to explain the causes as well as the effects of climate change for these particular questions. Now that we've finished looking at our checklist and the important concepts that you will need to know, let us move on to question 1. Let's have a look at that question. It says, refer to figure 1, which shows how temperatures over a city and its surrounding areas differ. This is an example of microclimate. Now, when you approach this question, one key definition that we looked at was microclimate. And you should already know that that refers to a localized climate, which can either be experienced over a valley when we did valley climates, or can be experienced over an urban area when we looked at urban climates. If we have a look at the diagram, it says figure 1 represents temperatures over a city. That should immediately tell you that you are dealing with an urban climate. If we have a look at the diagram, you will see a couple of important things. You will see that they've given you the y-axis showing temperature readings. Please, people, remember that when you're writing down an answer and they ask you for a temperature, if you don't put the unit, for example, degrees Celsius, they will not mark it correct. So never forget to put your unit, please. If we have a look furthermore at that diagram, we'll see they've labeled where the CBD is, they've labeled the rural areas as well as farmland areas. And if you have a look at that graph, you'll notice that there's a marked difference in the red temperature line as we move from the urban area, sometimes known as downtown, towards the rural area. Let's have a look at those questions. Right, question 1.1 says, give the concept used to describe the condition shown in figure 1. Now, when we did this section, one of the big parts of it was learning about urban heat island. So when they say give the concept, they just want the phrase that describes the situation which you saw in the diagram. So our correct answer would be an urban heat island. Also look at your mark allocation. If they only say 1 times 2 for 2 marks, most of the time they're looking for a one-word answer or even just a phrase. We have a look at question 1.2. It asks you to state the approximate surface temperature being experienced over the city center. If I scroll up back to the diagram, when you're reading or trying to get a reading off a graph, you must remember to give an accurate as possible reading as you can. Even use a ruler if you have to, all right? So let's have a look at our CBD. If I were to use a ruler, and I were just to mark off where that temperature reading intersects with the CBD, Okay? I can read it off more effectively. Use your ruler in order to get a decent reading from there. I don't have a ruler, so mine wasn't straight, but don't forget your rulers. So if we read it off there, we will see that it's just over halfway point between 33 degrees Celsius and 34 degrees Celsius. So usually they give you a little bit of leeway when you're giving an answer. So to be safe, let's say it's roughly 33.7 degrees. Let's write it in. 33.7 degrees Celsius. So many times I mark papers and people don't put their units in. You are losing very easy marks, people, so please remember to put them in. Again, it's only worth 2 marks, so they're only looking for one thing. Let's look at the next question. Question 1.3. Choose the correct word from those given in the brackets. So they're giving you a selection, and you must give the correct one. A, temperature either decreases or increases outwards from A. Let's go back to that diagram. If you have a look at the diagram, you'll notice that the highest temperature readings were over the city center, so that's the center of the city. And then as we move outwards from the city, slowly but surely, we see the temperature steadily decreasing. So the answer must indeed be that it decreases. Let's select the correct word on our paper. So it decreases outwards from A. Question B, we need to say if temperature decreases or increases upwards from A at night. Let's go back to the diagram again. When I marked this question last year in the exam, there was a bit of a discrepancy. Because if we have a look at the diagram, you'll see that the temperature values are actually increasing. They're getting higher in value as you travel further upwards in the atmosphere. So by virtue of that, they would have to accept the fact that the temperature could possibly increase, hence causing a temperature inversion. However, we know that from that point upwards, temperature also decreases with increasing altitude, which is what we would expect from any given scenario. So they would have to accept both increases and decreases. Doesn't happen often, but sometimes both options are actually correct. So I've underlined both of them there for you. Let's have a look at the next one. Question C. Pollution either decreases or it increases the temperature at A. If we look back at the diagram, A was our CBD. And remember, over our CBD, we've got lots of power stations. We've got lots of cars emitting all sorts of greenhouse gases. And from your studies all the way from grade 8 and 9, you should already know that greenhouse gases actually help to trap terrestrial radiation in the atmosphere. So our answer there should be the fact that it increases the temperature. Right, so there's our selection there. Let's choose the correct one. Pollution increases the temperature at A. That concludes the short questions for the first question of the climate section. Let us move on quickly to the next question, question 2. All right, question 2 says to study the synoptic chart. Now, you've had lots of practice with synoptic charts in grade 10 and grade 11, so there really is no excuse that you are still getting the features and the identification of those features wrong in this paper. So we've got a synoptic weather map, and we need to answer the questions. We have a look at that synoptic map. Usually it's printed in white and black for you to see. There's a few interesting things going on here. Let's discuss them before we actually get to the question. First thing that appears very clearly to me here is the presence of this low pressure. All right? Now, if you notice, this low pressure is along the coast, the west coast of our country. And those low pressures, they look fairly small in size, are always known as coastal low pressures. Just to reiterate a couple of key concepts with low pressures, just remember that the air always rises and the air converges at the surface of the Earth. In the southern hemisphere, a low pressure will rotate clockwise. In the northern hemisphere, the opposite happens. It rotates anti-clockwise. So there's our coastal low. If we have a look, there's another pressure system, a high pressure system on the eastern side of our country. And you should already know the names of those high pressures. Firstly, they're part of the subtropical high pressure belt, but then within that high pressure belt, they have separate names. So on the eastern side of our country, it's over the Indian Ocean, so it's called the South Indian High Pressure, or you can call it the South Indian Anticyclone. Just to go over a few concepts about high pressures as well, just to consolidate that material, you need to remember that a high pressure does the opposite of a low pressure. In a high pressure, the air sinks, it diverges at the Earth's surface. In the southern hemisphere, it rotates anti-clockwise, and in the northern hemisphere, it rotates clockwise. So there's two pressure cells that are very common over our country. If we have a look slightly further south, we've got some interesting weather systems occurring. You will notice that they consist of a front and another front here. When we have cold fronts and warm fronts situated together, we know those as mid-latitude cyclones. And we have 3 of them traveling more or less south, or some might even affect our country. When they occur in groups like you see here, they are called families. Right? They stick together, they're family. So they travel in groups called families. It's also a usual question that they tend to ask in the matric paper. If you have a look, they've shown you various weather stations here. They've shown you one for PE. They've shown you one, an automated weather station with low temperatures of 13 degrees. They often show you Marion Island, which is often the forecaster for weather conditions that will affect us later. So you need to be able to read those weather synoptic stations very well as well. Let's have a look at the questions quickly. All right. 2.1 asks you to identify, so just in a word or a phrase, the low pressure system labeled A. We've discussed this already, so just let's have a look. There A is right there. Remember, low pressure on the coast, a coastal low. Very easy. Let's write that in. Coastal low. And that will get you your 2 marks there. Let's have a look at the next question. 2.2. Explain why the pressure system labeled A, so the coastal low pressure, is referred to as a low pressure cell. If you have a look back at the diagram, you have to actually get evidence from the synoptic chart to support your answer. Now you can't see that the air is rising there, okay? You can't really see too much whether or not it's converging or diverging. There aren't enough weather stations for that. But you can see the rotation of it. All right, so if you have a look at your wind directions. Let me use a different color here. There's your wind direction. So it's coming from the northwest. There's another wind direction coming from the east. And we can see more or less that it's making a clockwise motion. So look at those wind directions and see if they're moving clockwise or anti-clockwise. So for our answer there, we know that firstly that the wind is moving clockwise, so southern hemisphere, it has to be a low pressure. There's another factor as well you can look at. Look at the values inside your pressure cell. I'm just going to erase it so you guys can see it clearly. All right, there we go. You will see that they've written some values there, 1012 and 1014. Just a little bit of recap before we go into the readings inside the center of the cell. 1012 and 1014 represent isobaric readings. What do I mean by that? Pressure readings. And we measure those in one of 2 things, either millibars or hectopascals. So either millibars or hectopascals is going to be the unit with which you attach to your answer. Okay. So if we have a look there, we'll notice that the lower pressure reading is in the center of the cell. So when our pressure gets lower as we go towards the center of the cell, or it decreases as we get towards the center of the cell, we know it's a low pressure. Okay, let's have a look at our answer. So explain why the pressure system is referred to as a low pressure. It's only worth 2 marks, 1 times 2, so they're only really looking for one thing. I've given you 2. All right, so we can either write that it's got a clockwise air movement, or we can write that the lowest pressure reading is at the center of the cell. Incidentally, it was 1012 hectopascals. Okay? Millibars is the other alternative for your unit there. Just remember, when you're looking at synoptic weather maps and you're looking at the hectopascal readings, they often ask you additional questions. They say, what is the isobaric interval on your synoptic map? Now, usually, just as a rule, remember it's 4 hectopascals. But if you have a look on your particular weather map, you'll see that there's a dotted line and then a solid line in the middle here. So when we have a dotted line, it means they're only going up by 2 millibars or 2 hectopascals. Okay, so usually it'll be 4 hectopascal intervals. Let's have a look at the next question. They ask you, what evidence is there on the map that it is winter? Now, when I teach this section in grade 10, I always tell them that the first thing you ever look for on a synoptic chart is if there's a date attached to it. Because usually on the bottom right-hand corner of that map, they'll tell you the day, the month, as well as the year. And by knowing which months are summer and winter in South Africa, you can deduce the answer quite easily. On this map, however, it's not going to be so easy. All right, so there's no date there. So what do? We have a look at the pressure systems that affect our country during winter months or summer months. Okay? So with that, you need to have a very good background knowledge of exactly what pressure systems impact us in summer and exactly what pressure systems and weather conditions affect us in winter. Now, you should be used to the presence of cold fronts in winter because it makes us all cold, makes the air very dry. So that's our first clue, presence of our cold fronts. Presence of cold fronts as well as coastal lows. Usually they occur in winter as well. We also need to have a look and not neglect our high pressure system. So if we have a look at the South Indian high pressure system here, notice that it's very close to the coastline. The high pressure, which is just off the eastern coast of South Africa, has some primary characteristics that should be part of your basic knowledge. You should remember that high pressures consist of dry, sinking air. No moisture is going to get evaporated and make clouds if our air is sinking. So sinking air is generally very heavy, very dense, it's very dry. The air also diverges at the Earth's surface. So based on the idea that we have dry descending air, it means we're going to have clear skies and sunny weather. So that high pressure, that South Indian anticyclone, is primarily responsible for the ideal outdoor weather that we get over the east coast on this particular synoptic chart. Let's write our answer in. Okay. All right, so we need to say that the South Indian high pressure, I'm just abbreviating here, South Indian high pressure creates dry, descending air, or sinking air, however you want to say it. This brings clear skies. So when they ask you why, they're also asking you to explain why. So you can't just say that there's a South Indian high pressure and it's therefore going to be clear. You need to say that the air sinks in that high pressure system, making the air dry, therefore creating your clear skies. Let's have a look at the next question. 2.5. Give a reason for the overcast conditions at Marion Island. We need to go back to our diagram once more. We need to find Marion Island. There it is. And you will see that the colored in circle, just by the pink line there, means that we have 8/8 overcast cloudy conditions. Now, if we have a look at what's causing that, you'll notice that there's a cold front that has just passed, and there's an occlusion and a cold front on the way. Now remember, when you studied cold fronts and mid-latitude cyclones in your matric syllabus, you were taught that where we have a front, cooler air wedges in underneath the warmer air and pushes it up. And it's the result of this uplift of air that creates condensation, evaporation, and cloud formation. So you need to be able to describe the fact that your cold air from behind the cold front, okay, is pushing up the warmer air from in front of that cold front, and it's creating conditions that are conducive to evaporation, condensation, and cloud formation. Okay. Let's write that down. We need to say that there was a cold front, okay, or the presence of a mid-latitude cyclone, and that means that warmer air is pushed upwards above your cooler air. And it's as a result of this that we get condensation and clouds forming. Question 3, they give you a newspaper article. So it is referred to the newspaper article on SA penguins on thin ice, okay? And answer the questions that follow. All right, I'm going to read through it with you very quickly. It says, scientists report disturbing conditions at Marion Island. The population of penguins is dropping at Marion and Gough Island. Although researchers are still trying to figure out the reasons for the decreasing number of penguins, the trend is almost certainly due to global climate change. When you're reading through it, you should also be highlighting. Together with this, the average annual sea temperature has increased from 5.3 degrees Celsius to 6.8 degrees Celsius. The total annual rainfall has also dropped. Major changes in food chains have occurred with a decrease in squid and krill, which are the main source of food for penguins. So from reading this article, you should already know that we're referring to a result of global climate change. And when you're dealing with your syllabus, they're going to be asking you a lot about global warming. They usually put articles or they'll put cartoons, and they'll ask you often essay questions with it. They'll ask you to define global climate change or global warming, as well as the causes that lead up to it. Let's have a look at our questions very quickly. Question number 1. What does global climate change literally mean? Right? The answer is very simple. As the statement suggests, it's a change in the average climate or the average weather conditions that are being experienced. So it represents an average change, let's write it down, in climate conditions, and this can be experienced across the globe. Right, easy as that. If you just learn that, you get 2 marks. Simple, huh? Let's have a look at the next question quickly. It asks you to give one reason for the rise in sea temperatures. Right? Now, our sea temperatures are getting hotter and hotter, but there's something that has to cause that. Now remember, global climate change and global warming deal with the fact that our air is getting warmer because of all the greenhouse gases trapping heat in our atmosphere. Our atmosphere has a direct relationship with the oceans that lie beneath it. So for that answer, you need to say that because our global temperatures are rising, or atmospheric temperatures are rising, it's also causing our sea temperatures to rise. Funnily enough, they'll actually also accept the reasons behind that change in temperature. They'll accept increased pollution. They'll accept increased industrialization, increased pollution from cars. The variety of answers was huge. So there really is no reason why you shouldn't be getting marks here. All right, so we could just quite simply say that due to pollution or increased greenhouse gases, however you want to word that, okay, or GHGs, let's say greenhouse gases, air temperatures are rising. And these directly affect sea surface temperatures. SSTs, just my shorthand there for sea surface temperatures. I don't have space to put it there, but if you mention any of those effects once more or causes of global warming, they will mark it right. Let's have a look at the next question. Besides the rise in temperature, state 2 factors identified by scientists as reason for the decreasing penguin numbers. Now you can refer to your article here to get those answers. It's almost like a comprehension, but the answers weren't exclusive to that newspaper article. So let's have a look at some of those reasons which they mentioned. Let's go back to article. Once more, they said that the total annual rainfall has dropped. They mentioned the changes in the food chains as well as decreases in squid and krill. Okay, let's have a look at our question again. Okay, so remember penguins, they need a food supply. So because they have not enough krill left, so a decrease in squid and krill. Right? Their food chains have been disrupted in this manner. You could also mention other things aside from that. So you could talk about an oil spill. You could talk about pollution. Let's go back. There's a couple of others. All right. Changes in food chains. Let's add that in as well. Changes in food chains. Remember that if you take out one organism in a food chain, you're going to disrupt the very delicate balance that exists between all the other organisms. So even the smallest change impacts hugely on other species. Let's have a look at the next question, question 3.4. The impact of climate change is a concern for all those living in South Africa. In approximately 12 lines, this is your essay question, suggest some measures that need to be put in place to address this problem. Now this you've been doing since grade 10, so you should know many, many methods by which we can reduce the effects of global climate change. Now the first one that comes to mind is the idea of pollution. And when we talk about pollution, we need to decrease our greenhouse gases. How do we do that? We already know that most of our greenhouse gases come from a variety of sources. So the first of those is industrialization, all right? So we need to reduce the amount of industry we use with non-renewable methods. We also need to improve our transportation system because that reduces greenhouse gases too. Especially things like public transport. if we consider the idea of industry, we also need to look at renewable forms of energy. So using things like solar power, wind energy, tidal energy, those are all viable, renewable options for energy production in Southern Africa. In addition to that, you should have also learned that one of the primary reasons we have so many greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is because of the rate of deforestation. Now remember, forests and algae living in the sea, any plants, they act as what we call a carbon sink. And carbon sinks remove all those harmful carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases from the atmosphere and help to recycle oxygen back into the atmosphere. So we need to reduce deforestation. That's a big one. So we need to reduce deforestation. Even things like the way we build our buildings, because they absorb a lot of heat. If we use more reflective building materials, it helps to rather reflect the light instead of absorbing it. Now, I don't have too much space on my page left, so I'm just going to explain a few more things. We also need to maintain green belts in our cities. If in doubt, if you're ever stuck with an answer or a last point to put in your essay, you can even talk about educating people on the consequences of global climate change, which is exactly what we're trying to do here. You should also know about major agreements that were signed between nations. A big example of that was the Kyoto Protocol. And that protocol said that countries who signed it had to reduce their carbon emissions by a vast percentage. And what we're doing now lately in industry is if they don't do that, there are actually fines. There's legislation, there's laws saying that you have to reduce your carbon emissions. Even the cars we drive have to be within a certain framework for carbon emissions. That is the end of question 3. I think it's time, and I think it's time for a well-deserved break. Let's go to an ad break. Welcome back, learners of South Africa. I admire your determination and will to do well in your exams. Let's get through the last of these questions to help you prepare. Let's look at question 4. Question 4 was adapted from the short questions of the first paper, or paper 1 from November 2012. It asks you to refer to a figure that shows factors that influence the weather and climate over South Africa. You have to complete the following sentences by filling in the missing word. Let's have a look at the diagram. When you're filling in missing words or choosing from a selection of ideas from a diagram, just remember sometimes they're actually giving you answers to choose from in the diagram. So don't try and make up something by yourself. Look and see what they're giving you first and then choose from that selection. Sometimes they'll give you a list to choose from, otherwise it's going to be less implicit and you're going to have to look at the diagram. If we have a look at the diagram, there's a couple of things very quickly. We'll see that the plateau is playing quite a large role. Our plateau meaning our high-lying area before we reach the escarpment. It's fairly high above sea level, so our temperatures are actually fairly cool in comparison to other places of the same latitude, okay, a lot of the time. We have our 2 currents. The warm Mozambique current, it makes the east coast warm, moist, lots of rainfall. The cold Benguela current has the opposite effect. It makes the west coast dry, quite cool at times, and obviously reduces the impact of rainfall there. We also have our escarpment, which has rather steep slopes, and it acts as a barrier to moist air coming off from the Indian and Atlantic anticyclones onto the plateau. So our plateau is drier in winter because of that barrier formed and less moisture comes inland. Let's have a look at the questions. 4.1. The Something Ocean keeps the east coast of our country warmer than the west coast. Remember, you should automatically know this by now, and from your diagram you saw the Mozambique current, but rather call it the warm Mozambique current. So the warm Mozambique ocean current. And that will get you 2 marks. If we have a look at the next question, 4.2. The something causes places in the interior of the country to experience lower temperatures due to its higher altitude. We're talking about higher altitude. Remember I mentioned that word plateau. So our plateau being at quite a high elevation makes our temperatures cooler. Right, so the plateau is the correct answer here. Right, let's look at 4.3. The position of South Africa in terms of its something generally results in stable conditions. Now, we lie on a roughly 30 degrees south line of latitude, which means we're under the subtropical high pressure belt. Okay, so it says the position of South Africa in terms of its latitude, 30 degrees south. Okay, so they're looking for the word latitude. Remember, 30 degrees south means that we have stable conditions. If you're not sure what the word stable means, it generally means dry, sunny conditions. And what's responsible for those? High pressures. 4.4. The steep slopes of the something prevent moisture from reaching the interior in winter. Remember I said our escarpment has steep slopes. So look for those little phrases that kind of hint at what they're talking about. So the escarpment is what they're looking for here. 4.5, the something ocean current contributes to the dry, arid is the same thing as dry, conditions along the west coast of South Africa. And this is grade 10 work, so you should know it off the top of your head. The cold Benguela current makes those dry, arid conditions happen on the west coast. Always call it a cold Benguela or a warm Mozambique, because you're telling the marker that you know exactly what type of current that is. Those are the short questions. Let's move on to question 5. Right, question 5. It says study figure 5, which shows the frequency of the occurrence of tropical cyclones. If we have a look quickly at the diagram, you will see that they've given you the frequencies in the form of a bar graph for all the areas of our oceans. And they tell you more or less how much each of those bars represent. Okay? Notice as well that those tropical cyclones are rarely above 30 degrees north or 30 degrees south. They're occurring within the tropics. They're also not occurring right on the equator. The reason for that being, when we have tropical cyclones, there's no Coriolis force to help them move or form for that matter. Although the sea surface temperatures are warm and they form in this tropics area, it's tropical, it's hot. The sea surface temperatures are at least 26.5, 27 degrees Celsius. Let's have a look at those questions quickly. Question 5.1 asks you, name, don't explain anything, the ocean with the highest number of tropical cyclones. We have a look there, they've labeled all our oceans for there, they're being nice to us. So if we have a look at where the biggest bars are, there's quite a big one in the Pacific Ocean, another big one there, a couple more in the Pacific Ocean on that side of our map. So by default we can already see by just looking at the sizes of those bar graphs that the Pacific Ocean is experiencing quite a large number of tropical cyclones. So quite simply, to name the ocean, the Pacific Ocean. Let's write that in. Pacific Ocean. Always get into the habit of writing ocean. It's like forgetting your surname when you're writing out your name. It's called Pacific Ocean, not just Pacific. Okay, I don't like it when they do that. All right, next question, 5.2. Explain why there's a lack of tropical cyclones along the equator, 0 degree latitude. Now remember, I just said to you that there's no Coriolis force at the equator, and that is the dominant reason why we don't get any tropical cyclones forming, although the temperatures are quite high. So you can quite simply say Coriolis force is 0 at equator. They're only asking for 2 marks there, so you only need to give them one thing. Let's look at the next question. 5.3. What is the relationship between the occurrence of tropical cyclones and the sea temperature that exceeds, so goes higher than 26.5 degrees Celsius? The higher our sea surface temperatures go, the more evaporation takes place, the more condensation occurs, the more clouds and cumulonimbus clouds form, and the more tropical cyclones we are going to experience. So the relationship is, you need to phrase it as when one section or one aspect does one thing, what happens to the other. So when we have an increase in temperature, we have an increase in the number of tropical cyclones. So you need to write that out. Increase in sea surface temperatures causes an increase in occurrence of tropical cyclones. Okay, quite simple. And that's also only worth 2 marks, but you have to state the full thing. Next question. Give 2 reasons why tropical cyclones do not occur in the area marked A. Let's find A quickly. You have a look at A. It's south of South Africa, and we already know that we're in the 30 degrees subtropical high pressure belt zone. So if we have high pressures, that's not going to mean we're going to have large scale condensation and evaporation at all. Okay? So you can actually state that. The fact that we are too far south for tropical cyclones to form. We have high pressures. Let's fill it in. All right, so our reason, it is too far south. So in other words, plus minus 30 degrees south means that we have subtropical high pressures, which cause stable, dry conditions. Okay, so that's one reason as well. As we go further south towards our polar regions as well, if you remember, we also get colder. So our sea surface temperatures are also too cold. So sea surface temperatures are less than the required 26.5 degrees Celsius. They can't form, or less than 27 degrees. Usually they use 27 degrees Celsius. So there's your 2 reasons there. Let's move on. Question 5.5. Explain, so you're going to have to write a little bit here, why tropical cyclones dissipate. Dissipate means that they wither away, they die out when they move over land. Now there are 2 dominant reasons that I always teach my matrics. And the first thing is the differences in the consistencies of the surfaces. The ocean is a relatively smooth surface, where the land is undulating, it's hilly. So the fact that we have hills and a more uneven surface of the land creates friction. So we can actually write that down. Friction from land surface actually slows the tropical cyclone. We also know that tropical cyclones form because of a large supply of moisture and high temperatures. When they move over land, they've got no moisture. Remember that a tropical cyclone is driven and sustained due to the idea of latent heat being reduced or released during the process of condensation. So we have less moisture, less condensation, and therefore less latent heat. And there's 2 reasons for you right there. Question 5.6. State, so we don't have to explain too much, the impact that tropical cyclones have on the economy of countries that lie in their path. Now, most of matric students, they read that question, they're like, yes, I know lots of impacts or effects that tropical cyclones cause, but they don't look for the exact type of effect that the question is asking. And it's only the economy, not the environment, not society, not people. So if you do give extra effect to do with society or with the environment, they will mark that as irrelevant, so be careful there. So if we're looking at the economy, what drives our economy? And one of those things is agriculture, all right? So we're going to have reduced crop yields. And if we have reduced crop yields, it means that we don't have enough food and our food prices rise. We also have large-scale damage to infrastructure. So damage to infrastructure. And this is always costly to repair. Because of that, we have to import more food, we have to import supplies, and that means that we have to spend money. We also don't have enough exports, so reduced exports. And so our economy starts to decline. We need to get foreign aid from other countries to help with the refugees or people that have suddenly been displaced, which also costs a lot of money. Usually that's worth about 12 marks as an essay question, but luckily for you guys, it was only worth 3 points for 6 marks there. Let's look at the last question. Question 6. Refer to figure 6. That is a cartoon about drought. So firstly, you need to know what drought means, and the general accepted definition is it's a reduced amount of water or reduced availability of water to meet the normal needs of agriculture, industry, domestic use. Okay, let's have a look at the cartoon. The Millie says there, we are all out of water, we won't be able to grow to this size anymore. And you can see there that they are suffering without water. Okay? If you don't have water, your plants are not going to grow, okay? Which is a direct result of drought. If you don't have plants, you're not going to have food, and it leads on to a whole bunch of other knock-on effects that deplete or cause our economy to decline. Let's have a look at the questions. All right, first one, easy. Explain the term drought. Okay? All you need to speak about is the fact that it's a reduced availability of water. And this could be due to a number of things. You can add in there due to reduced rainfall, due to overpopulation, due to mal-managed infrastructure even. Okay? So as long as you talk about a reduced availability of water to meet normal needs. If you have a look at the next question, 6.2. It asks us, what is the message of the statement, we won't be able to grow to this size anymore? Okay? Now remember I said to you that if we don't have enough rainfall, our crops don't grow properly, all right? So reduced rainfall or reduced water reduces the yield of our crops, as well as the quality of crops. If we don't have enough crops, it might lead to situations of famine. So if we don't have enough food, we're going to have food insecurity or times of famine. You can talk about the fact that our food prices are going to rise. And that will get you 2 times 2 marks. Only 2 things are necessary there. Let's have a look at question 6.3. Why is maize farming especially risky for small-scale subsistence farmers? Okay, that's more of a higher level question. Firstly, you need to understand what it means to be a subsistence farmer. There's a difference between subsistence and commercial. Subsistence basically means that you are farming for yourself and your family to consume all that food without selling any of it for profit. Whereas commercial farming means you're farming on a large scale to sell most of that yield for profit. Okay? So why is maize farming in this situation risky for our subsistence farmers? Now there's a couple of things we need to discuss here. Remember, subsistence farmers, they're usually poorer. So most of our subsistence farmers are in Africa. So the first idea is that in Africa, we experience a lot of drought, especially in the Sahel region in the western parts of South Africa. And subsistence methods are the only way in which they're going to get food. If you think about subsistence farmers, they don't have access to technology. So they don't use drought-resistant seeds. So they have no genetically modified seeds. For example, drought resistance. They also don't have access to irrigation. So they have improper irrigation methods. Most of the time they're only relying on the rainfall they receive. They don't have sprinkler systems, they don't have dams to store water or anything like that. Let's move on. It's only for 1 mark, so there's 3 things to choose from there. Right, and lastly, question 6.4, we're nearly there. It says Africa urgently needs to address the problem of drought. Make suggestions, approximately 12 lines, on how to sustainably reduce the impact of drought. Okay? Now this is a section that the present grade 12s also did in grade 11, and I've said to my present matrics they need to go back and make sure they know the measures to combat drought effects as well as flood effects. And there are a number of things. Let's see if I can list as many as I can. All right, so when we're talking about drought, we need to make sure that we have adequate water storage methods. Okay? So we need to build dams or other water storage facilities. Okay? We also need to make sure that we use our water wisely. And one of the ways in which they do that in this country is they impose water restrictions, which means you can only use a certain amount of liters a day. So water restrictions is another one. Just remember to write this all out in sentences, please. So water restrictions. Okay? We need to also adopt other methods such as stockpiling livestock feed, stockpiling drought-resistant seeds. Let's add that in. So we need to stockpile livestock feed to keep our animals healthy. We need to stockpile seeds. We also need to look at the way in which we irrigate our plants. One of the things about previous methods of irrigation is firstly they water their plants at the wrong time of the day, and they use what they call a sprinkler system. And what that basically does is it releases the water in a spray. And if you've got tiny droplets of water, it means it increases the overall surface area of that water, which is therefore more prone to evaporation. All right? So we need to adopt proper irrigation methods. And one of those methods is called drip irrigation. Now what they do with drip irrigation is they have a piping system that runs along the ground, and then they literally let water drip. And so because you've got bigger drops of water, it minimizes the surface area of that water so that it doesn't get evaporated so quickly. Okay. Other things we can do. We also need to maintain our wetlands, because remember, wetlands are important sources of water. If we don't have those, we're going to lose out on a valuable supply of water, not just for ourselves, but also for our biodiversity, our different species of plants and animals. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, as well as 7 there, and that's more than enough to cater for your question. Learners of South Africa, I hope you have benefited from this session on weather and climate, and I hope that you continue in your studious preparation for your exams. Best of luck. We are thinking of you. Your teachers are there for you. We are here to support you. Goodbye, learners.